presidential conference, so it's good for me to introduce the first paper so I can learn names as I take questions. So to introduce our first speaker, who I'm sure everybody knows very, very well, not least from his diligent emails, we've got the Moderator of Wessex Synod, Michael Hopkins. So Michael has recently published Pastoral Care in Practice, which is at the back in the bookshop, which he published with Canterbury Press, and he completed his PhD in 2012. Today's talk has... Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, 2021, sorry. Regardless of when he finished it, today's talk has absolutely nothing to do with it. And he's talking about something completely different, because he has many talents and boundless energy for churchy things. Michael's title today is From the Northern Saints to the Durham Saints, an introduction to Durham and its Dissent.
Thank you. Durham makes no sense without knowing something of St Cuthbert. St Cuthbert makes no sense without knowing something of St Aidan. St Aidan makes no sense without knowing something of St Columba and Iona. St Columba and Iona makes no sense without, well, I think you're getting the idea now. But with the graveyard slot after dinner, half of you will be desperate to go to bed and the other half will be desperate for a drink. So I'm not going to keep you too late for either of those options. By the way, I was asked if the college bar's open. The answer is I don't know. But it's in the quad, which is halfway to the dining room. So if it's open, that's where it is. And if it's not, I know several very nice pubs nearby. Now, St Aidan was an Irish monk from the monastery that Columba had founded on Iona. The Britons had been Christian before the Irish because Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Missionaries from there took the faith to Ireland, most famously St Patrick. When the power of Rome declined, the Angles began to infiltrate Britain and gradually turned it into England. Those incoming Angles were pagans and Christianity largely disappeared from Britain. It came back in two directions. In the north from Columba, who went from Derry to Iona and evangelised Scotland, and in the south from Augustine, who landed in Kent around about the same time, which was AD 597. Up here, Northumbria was created by the English warrior leader Ethelfrith. He was killed in battle 616 and his children fled into exile. Some of these children found their way into bits of what are now southwest Scotland, where they met the Irish monks of Iona and accepted the Christian faith. The key point really is that the north of England and the south of Scotland were fairly fluid at that point. The second son of Ethelfrith was Oswald, famous as the Christian king. He grew up determined to regain the throne of Northumbria and to enable the pagans among his people to hear about Christianity. In 633 he fought a successful battle and established himself as king, choosing Bamborough. I can't think why. A natural outcrop of rock where later castle was built. Oswald invited the monks of Iona to send a mission, and eventually Aidan and 12 other monks arrived to settle on what many call Lindisfarne, but locally is always Holy Island. And here Aidan established an Irish type of monastery. Lots of wooden buildings, buildings for communal purposes, workshops and so on. They learnt the English language, and their English king, Oswald, who'd learnt Irish in his boyhood in exile, helped them. And they went out using Aidan's only method as a missionary to walk the lanes, to talk to the people that he met and interest them in the faith if he could. His monks visited and revisited the villages where he sowed the seeds, and in time local Christian communities were formed. One story tells that the king, worried that Bishop Aidan was walking like a peasant, gave him a horse. Aidan gave it away to a beggar. He wanted to walk as the people did. Aidan needed to ensure that his efforts did not die when he did, as Christianity had previously done in that part of England. What was needed was English leadership for an English church. Then the answer lay in education, as it often does. Aidan's monastery and the monasteries that he founded took in 12 boys in a monastery at a time and taught them reading and writing in Latin and the practical skills of being a monk. In doing so, they provided food and a home to boys who would otherwise be taking their chances in what was a very wild world. A modern cynic might ask how much faith was always involved in every case at the beginning, when a nice home and food was provided, but the system turned out many faithful monks. As the Christian faith spread in England, double monasteries developed, with an abbess and nuns in the same establishment, but very much not in close contact. Many of the nuns were just as learned as the monks, and their contribution was everywhere. Aidan himself made sure that it was possible in Northumbria for women to become nuns if they so wished. And it was Aidan who encountered the woman who was the most famous abbess in her day, Hild, abbess first at Hartlepool and then at Whitby. At least 5 of her male students went on to become bishops. One of our former presidents, Elaine Kay, was the daughter of a Yorkshire congregational minister. And certainly I learned at her funeral, as a child, she was not best pleased with Hilda as a middle name. But she changed her view when she learned of her namesake, Hild of Whitby. Aidan died at Bamborough in 651, and that's when it moves on to Cuthbert. Cuthbert was born in 635, the year Aidan founded the monastery on Lindisfarne. Cuthbert was from a well-to-do family, and he was brought up as a Christian. He was credited but with saving by his prayers some monks who were caught swept out to sea on a raft. It's also said that when he went swimming, he was dried by the otters who breathed their breath upon him. I will leave you to decide for yourselves the veracity of these stories. Cuthbert's life changed when he was about 17. He was looking after some neighbours' sheep on the hills. He wasn't a shepherd boy, so perhaps he was on military guard duties. Gazing into the night sky, he saw a light descend to the earth and then return, escorting, he thought, a human soul to heaven. The date was the 31st of August 651, and it was the night that Aidan died. That was Cuthbert's moment of decision. He went to the monastery at Melrose, another of Aidan's monasteries, and he spent 13 years there. When Melrose was given land to found a new monastery at Ripon, Cuthbert went with them and was the guest master. And he returned to Melrose and later became the prior. In 664, the Synod of Whitby decided that Northumbria should cease to look to Ireland for its spiritual leadership and turn instead to Rome via Canterbury. You pay your money and you take your choice, but for me that was the most wrong decision that could ever have been made. The Irish monks of Lindisfarne went back to Iona, and the Abbot of Melrose became Abbot of Lindisfarne, and Cuthbert its prior. Cuthbert was there for about 10 years, active as a missionary running the monastery, much in demand as a spiritual guide. He was outgoing, cheerful, compassionate and popular. But when he was 40, he believed he was being called to be a hermit and to do the hermit's job of praying in solitude. He started out on what's now called St Cuthbert's Isle, adjacent to Lindisfarne. That's high tide. At low tide, it isn't an island. It didn't really work because he didn't get the solitude at low tide. So he moved on to Inner Farne, among the Farne Islands, where he lived for 10 years. And people still bothered him. They rowed out in their boats, seeking his advice and his healing. Having been myself to the Farne Islands one year in late October, I can attest that was the roughest sea crossing of my life. I didn't know it was possible for boats to go at angles that the boat went at and stay afloat. So perhaps he got some peace in the winter. At the age of about 50, Cuthbert was asked by the church and the king to leave his hermitage and become a bishop. He agreed very reluctantly. For 2 years he was active travelling bishop as Aidan had been. And on one occasion he visited the Queen in Carlisle, and he knew by second sight that her husband the king had been slain by the Picts in Scotland. Cuthbert felt the approach of death, and he retired to the hermitage back on Inner Farne, and he died in 687. His body was taken back to Lindisfarne, and people came to his grave and claimed miracles of healing from their prayers. To the monks of Lindisfarne, it was a clear sign that Cuthbert was a saint in heaven. In those days, people felt it important when they prayed for help or healing to be as close as possible to a saint's relic. And so if a community made relics available, it was the equivalent to a declaration of sainthood, and the monks of Lindisfarne did this for Cuthbert. They decided to allow 11 years for his body to become a skeleton and then elevate his remains on the anniversary of his death. And it was during those years that the manuscript known as the Lindisfarne Gospels was made, to be used for the first time at the ceremony of the elevation of Cuthbert's bones. It didn't quite go according to plan. They opened the coffin and they found not a skeleton, but a complete and undecayed body. That was a real sign of sainthood, and the cult of St Cuthbert began in earnest. People flocked to the shrine, and all this continued for another century until the 8th of June 793, when the Vikings came. The monks were totally unprepared. Some were killed, some younger ones and boys were taken away to be sold as slaves. Gold and silver was taken, the monastery was burned down. If you prefer the more accurate maps of what happened rather than the Victorian pictures. But the monastery was living under continuous threat. And there was a gradual movement of goods and buildings onto the mainland. The monastery at Lindisfarne was abandoned in 875, They packed up Cuthbert's body and all the relics and went looking for a new safe home on the mainland. For well over 100 years, they settled in the old Roman town of Chesterley Street in 883. They were so well settled that Durham Cathedral was very nearly built there. But the Vikings still appeared, so they went deeper inland to Ripon, but not for long, and on their way back they settled at Durham in 993. After the Norman conquest, the community was Benedictine and began to build the great Norman cathedral. We have a professional guide tomorrow afternoon who will no doubt tell us more about that than we could possibly imagine, so I won't preempt that. But the fine city of Durham is here on a bend in the River Wear. As you will have noticed, it's quite a secure location to build castles and fortresses because it is all uphill. The Great North Road travelled through Durham. That bridge, which is at about 8 o'clock, Prebends Bridge, is at the bottom of this road that we are on. At one point that was originally the Great North Road that went through past the cathedral and the marketplace. Mm. 1832 was a major change in Durham. The Prince Bishop, Durham was a county palatine, so the Prince Bishops ruled everything, not just the ecclesiastical. And the Bishop founded the University of Durham. He vacated Durham Castle to enable the university to move in there. And he moved to Auckland Castle, and the town was renamed Bishop Auckland. Around the same time, the Great North Road was diverted, so it no longer ran outside this building, in one of the earliest bypasses ever. In the 1960s, a bigger and better bypass took the road even further away. Now, I mention all of this for context because, as I said at the beginning, understanding Durham makes very little sense if you don't understand anything at all of Cuthbert. I have never made much sense of knowing about the Dissent in any community if I don't know about the context of the community. And despite the strong old Dissent, Durham is really a Methodist county and a Methodist city. But we'll come back to those later. Records of dissenters can be found in Durham right back into the 17th century. The Durham Record Office contains a will of a dissenter, an early dissenter, Nicholas Ladleby, dated the 27th of February 1642. Numerous later dissenters' wills. Calamy records many ejected in County Durham, but in the city itself, Jonathan Devereux was lecturer at St Nicholas. That's the church in the marketplace, which was the main parish church of the city, where George Carey succeeded Devereux 300 years later. Devereux had been a graduate, unsurprisingly, of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and before coming to Durham had been a lecturer at St Andrew's Holborn in London, rector of Walsingham in Weardale and preacher at Holtwhistle. He was clearly very popular in Durham because the mayor and corporation stated that they had chosen him and they wished him to remain. Their wish was not granted. He died in early 1663. Calamy also recalls that Joseph Holdsworth of Upper Poppleton near York was ejected in 1662. Holdsworth had been Vicar of St Oswald's, Durham, from 1653 to 1656. St Oswald's is on the right-hand edge of the picture at about 3 o'clock, and it's right on the edge of the picture. So it's the other side of the river, but really very close to here. Holdsworth resigned in 1656, but refused to leave. His name was mentioned in 1655 as a possible minister of Richmond, Yorkshire, but inquiries revealed that Holdsworth was so generally disliked that I think there was scarce one in the town did approve of him. Well, so much for the ministers. The dissenting people in Durham met in secret in the house of a shoemaker in Claypath. That's a street that runs from the marketplace going up the hill north. And they were subject to the usual persecutions in the years following 1662. A group were licensed to meet in a room in Claypath in 1672, and the first regular dissenting chapel in the city was built there in 1750. And in 1750 it was a Presbyterian chapel. Although some of you will appreciate that at the time, being Presbyterian and holding to the Orthodox Trinitarian faith was already challenging. The chapel became independent in 1821, not through any great love of independency, but to remain Orthodox. Durham was not a home for Unitarianism. The congregation outside the chapel building. I'm not an expert on costumes, but the people who were suggested that this picture dates from the 1850s or 1860s. That was the original chapel, or the remains thereof, but a new chapel was built in front of that in 1860 and further reconstruction in 1885. And by that point it was officially known as Durham Congregational Church. The old chapel at the rear became the halls, and in the early 1990s certainly the back part was sliding one way down the hill and the front part was subsiding down the other way. There was another independent chapel at Framwellgate, founded in 1778. You might be mistaken for thinking that was also in Durham, but it was a separate borough and a separate parish. The old dissenting chapel on Claypath having become congregational in the 19th century, it was only natural that the resurgent Presbyterians of the late 19th century would see fertile ground in Durham. And so the United Presbyterians formed a chapel in Waddington Street, a quiet back street almost under the railway, surrounded by row upon row of terraced houses. You can see it from the train, but you have to look the other way and miss the view of the cathedral. That picture is how I encountered the church in the 1990s. It's somewhat more comfortable these days. When the church was formed in 1872, there were 55 members, mostly expatriate Scots. They were described as not a wealthy congregation, but by sincerity, devotion and determination, faced often with great difficulties, they stood together. The building originally seated 250 people, with a gallery that was boxed in the 50s and the ceiling lowered. The organ was installed in 1895. It was one of, I think, 4 identical organs from the Durham organ builders Harrison and Harrison. One of the other identical organs was installed in the Congregational Chapel in Claypath. Now, I have a bit of primary source material, as I think we're supposed to call it now. Very gratefully, the Church magazine of Waddington Street URC has been featuring extracts from the memoirs of one of their late members, Leslie Rowland, elder and session clerk for a large chunk of the 20th century. He has some fascinating insights, and actually it's going to be much simpler if I just read you some of those rather than attempting anything cleverer. Don't worry, John, I'm not reading all of it.
I know how much there is.
As a Presbyterian family, we moved to Durham in 1912, and living next door to another family of the same denomination, we were soon absorbed into the life and congregation at Waddington Street. In those days, the Durham schools were all church schools, although it was notable that if you were not an Anglican, you had a lesser chance of sitting the scholarship examination unless you had strings to pull. You will have to go far to find a small church like ours with so many professional and expert people among its members, both in the present and in the past. In my 70 years, I know and have known as members retired ministers, doctors, farmers, solicitors, a judge, bank manager, head postmaster, surveyors, accountants, insurance managers, engineers, teachers, prison officers, police, university lecturers, gardeners, drapers, butchers, bakers, and many other occupations too numerous to number. I think you get the picture. There was a strong youth fellowship meeting weekly. The Sunday school was quite strong and drew a number of children from around the church. In the town, the Presbyterians were always noted for their catering and splendid teas, exploding the myth that Scots lived on Scotch broth and porridge. In May, there was an annual tea when the hall was packed, all for the princely sum of 1 shilling. In January of each year, the Sunday school had their annual party and prize giving, which all the parents attended. Although a bit late, Father Christmas seemed to turn up with apples and oranges. In the 1920s, under the guidance of Miss Stewart and Miss Green, there was the Young People's Guild. We met once, sometimes twice a week, where they taught us handicrafts, rug making, leatherwork, pewter work and Italian marquetry. We had a stall at the sale of work and raised a lot for church funds. In the early 30s, we had quite a strong Boy Scout troop, but with removals it was decided to amalgamate with one of the other city groups. In more recent times, there was a women's guild which met for a considerable time and an active young wives group. When they met, the menfolk had to stay in babysitting. I think these days we call that looking after your own children. Thinking of all the developments of all these years, we must agree that we have had a most versatile congregation of many talents and expertise. It may be shyness or Presbyterian reserve, but I cannot say, but experience has taught me that instead of asking for volunteers, look around and find a particular person's forte and then ask for their help. The answer is usually yes. It was a great pleasure for all for the church to move from being an aid-receiving congregation to being a self-supporting congregation. The membership has gradually grown. In 1914 it numbered 100. By 1925, 125. It stood at around 150 for some years. In 1957 it topped 170. When I became session clerk it was up to 245. Since then we have risen to 283. We have furnished the city with 7 mayors in all. I think it would now be at least 8. Presbyterianism was clearly a very strong tradition in this city and in this county, in the sense there was a strong Presbyterian church in the city of Durham. There was a strong Presbyterian church in every town in the county. The United Presbyterians had a Darlington Presbytery, which covered the counties of Yorkshire and Durham. But in 1896 this was divided to form a Presbytery of Durham and a Presbytery of Yorkshire. And I think that was primarily to do with growth in Yorkshire that necessitated that. When the new presbyteries were formed, the decision indicates each presbytery having a seat. Seems totally meaningless in a non-episcopal church. But the Presbytery of Yorkshire was to have its seat in Leeds, and the Presbytery of Durham was to have its seat in Sunderland, which is entirely unsurprising, as Sunderland was the strength of Durham Presbyterianism. But John will tell us about that tomorrow. So there was a Congregational church and a Presbyterian church in Durham. There is now only one United Reformed church in Durham. The Congregational church in Claypath did join the United Reformed Church, although the Claypath church and the Waddington Street church could not really have been more chalk and cheese, although you could just about see them from one another. Claypath Church was influenced by the evangelical movement, and in particular in the 1970s with the charismatic movement. They clung on to the URC by a slender thread. In the 1990s they called a charismatic Conservative minister from out with the URC, and when he moved on, various let's say misunderstandings and differences of view led to the congregation largely walking away from their building and forming an independent church meeting elsewhere. If you walk past the building now, you will still see it is a church, but it was sold for other use and eventually bought by another denomination, several buyers down the line. But a lot of that is a very difficult and raw story still for many people, and others would tell their view very differently. I arrived in this city 30 years ago this month as an undergraduate. You're all supposed to say that can't be possible. At that point, the majority of the academic staff in the chemistry department were churchgoers. One was a URC elder, another was the URC organist, at least a couple I recall were Methodists. And at that time, Waddington Street URC was vying with St George's Sunderland, where John was the minister, for the largest membership figure in the Durham district, both well up in the 200s. I might say that a membership figure in the high 200s was not matched by a congregation in the high 200s. 50 was more like it in Durham, from 200 plus members. But on the back row, every week, was the Reverend Professor Charles Cranfield, with a Greek New Testament in his hand, who would scare preachers witless simply by being there. Across the road, in North Road Methodist Church, which you may have seen if you came by train. You would have had Professor James Dunn and the Reverend Professor Charles Kingsley Barrett in the congregation. I said that Presbyterianism was strong in County Durham, and it was in one extent, with well-supported churches in each town, with prominent and well-respected citizens in membership. But Durham is a Methodist county as far as the dissenters go. I met my wife among the Methodists of Durham, so I say that with some appreciation. Durham City, which was not a large city, had 3 Methodist chapels in the city centre. North Road, which was Methodist New Connection. A little further down the road was the Jubilee Chapel, which was Primitive. And on the other side of the city centre, Elvet Methodist Church, built in 1903, and Wesleyan. There was a Methodist chapel in every suburb of the city and just about every village. And almost every one of those chapels was ex-primitive. Even in the 1990s, people from the village chapels would refer to Elvet in a very scathing tone as the other cathedral. The Presbyterians may have built their foundations on the teachers and the shopkeepers and the like, but the Methodists built on the foundations of being the chapels for the miners, who in the 19th century were the bedrock of the county. And even in the 1990s, service times were still set around shift changes at pits that had closed 30 years and more before. And if they weren't set around shift changes in a non-existent pit, they were set around the bus timetable for the preacher for a bus that no longer ran. A very kindly URC minister, David Roberts, helped nurture my own vocation by gently allowing me to preach. And a very kindly Methodist minister, who was later president of the Methodist Conference, said, well, if David will let you preach in the URC, I don't see why you can't preach in Methodist chapels. But with Charles Cranfield, Jimmy Dunn and Charles Kingsley Barrett lurking in congregations, I learned early on not to be scared. I also learned a lot about people in that sense. That's the village chapel at Sherburn Hill. I remember in the mid-1990s taking a midweek service there. One man who was in his 80s then talked vividly about the challenges that he had personally experienced as a miner in the 1930s, living through the Great Depression and the days when pits were owned privately before nationalisation. The Presbyterians had a great deal in Durham, city and county, but they didn't have the miners, so they didn't have most of the population. Now, bedtime or beer time are beckoning, so I'm just going to throw out a few random conclusions. The Northern Saints have shaped a region, and they have shaped it even more so, its ecclesiastical life, for hundreds of years in ways that still have major ramifications today. And you'll see that in stone when we walk round the cathedral. In some respects, Dissent in Durham, despite the Northern Saints, couldn't have been more typical. Presbyterians becoming congregational to stay orthodox, later Presbyterian church planting with a hefty Scottish accent, but also a Welsh accent and a Northern Irish accent. The Presbyterians in Durham certainly followed the common pattern of recruiting from the more well-heeled end of the social classes, further up the hierarchy than many of the other nonconformists. But they didn't attract the miners, and the Methodists did. In many respects, Durham exemplifies all the norms and typical patterns of dissent. Yet, still the Northern Saints cast a long shadow across northeast England, and that makes everything not quite the same. Just enough room to squeeze into this corner.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. I didn't know you could quite spend so much time. That was great. Should we take some questions? What time are we due to finish?
We haven't set a finish time on the schedule.
Well, let's set one, because otherwise that's dangerous.
Well, see how we go.
So who would like to kick off? Please, do.
Let me be provocative, Michael. The Northern Saints make it profoundly different, but in what way now?
In what way now? I think they're still everywhere around you. You go around a housing estate in Hartlepool and you find the streets are named after the Northern Saints. You would not find a housing estate in Surbiton where they're named after the local saints. And I think somehow it's cast such a strong shadow. It's still underlying stuff, in slightly intangible ways. And that means I'm struggling to answer your question without quite agreeing with you.
Could I comment on that?
Please.
I think one of the things is that quite different people within this region have a sense of belonging together because of the significance of the saints, and particularly Cuthbert. James Breslin always used to remark on the fact that if you were at a conference where they said, get into a group with people from your region, most will be looking round and saying, not quite sure, am I south, am I southwest, am I Midlands, East Midlands, West Midlands? Northeast, people just know they're northeast and they're together, and I think that heritage is part of the reason for that.
I have a question. You didn't really talk about the cathedral.
Well, we've got a guided tour of that tomorrow, so I didn't really want to give you duff information when we're getting proper information.
But you also didn't mention the saint that's in the cathedral.
Well, it's the tomb of St Cuthbert is in the centre of the cathedral, and the whole building only makes sense when you see it as a shrine to St Cuthbert. But I think the guide will explain that better tomorrow. As you look at that picture, just to the right of the central tower is the space that's above the tomb of Cuthbert. The tomb of St Bede is right on that picture, the left-hand edge of the cathedral, and looks like it was a little bit bolted on afterwards that you could almost miss.
Can I just link in with that a bit? And cathedral cities are sometimes difficult places for non-conformist churches to find what they're offering if they're of the more traditional pattern that the cathedral in some respects can't offer better. I mean, do you sense in Durham the cathedrals stimulated the non-conformist churches, or challenged them, or cooperated with them? What's been the sort of relationship, not architecturally, which we'll hear about tomorrow, but more in ecclesiastical terms?
I think class is a big factor in that. Lots of deans of Durham had Presbyterian housekeepers. The Presbyterians were made up of shopkeepers and so on. The Methodists were more the miners. The cathedral, I think, would have had the well-to-do people. I I think class plays a bigger element in English social and religious history than we like to admit most of the time. And certainly, if I could mention a 20th century story, 1970s, I think. The master of University College and his family attended the United Reformed Church in Durham because they said Church of England's always communion. We don't want communion every week.
Just have a quick nose. Right.
That's all right, we're still here.
Thank you, Victoria. Both Michael and John mentioned the very strong cohesive sense of identity which the saints, the legacy of the saints inspires even today the people of this region, or at least the people of Durham, that they have a strong sense of cohesion and identity. Do you think, and yet you painted a picture, a delightful picture of subsequent church life of Latter-day Saints, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians and others in Durham, which implied perhaps there were slight hints here and there of a lack of cohesion, a lack of identity over the years. Do you think this historical legacy, in fact, has influenced subsequent generations in Durham to be slightly more cohesive than perhaps they were or are in other parts of England? It's simply a question that occurred to me.
Well, I think part of the answer lies in how much you separate out Durham from other parts of the northeast. The city of Durham is very different from everywhere around it. Jeffrey.
In the 20th century, bishops of Durham have been scholars and prophets of considerable distinction and some renown. And I've found that Durham people have been showing loyalty to each one. But I wondered if you've got any comment about these leading personalities of both the C of E, but also can you point to any leading personalities apart from the three distinguished biblical scholars that you mentioned once or twice?
Well, I certainly remember hearing that David Jenkins was very well liked by his clergy in Durham because he went round the city visiting people, taking an interest in what they were doing and trying to say encouraging things, which seemed to go down quite well. I think it's a combination of cathedral and university which leads to more prominent and well-known people. And of course that's only been in existence since halfway through the 19th century.
I can attest to David Jenkins' pastoral attentions. He ended up in my room as an undergraduate at Oxford in my first week for reasons we needn't go into. But he really showed pastoral concern.
Going back to your thing about class and everything, was the Congregational Church kind of more on the shopkeepers, teachers, do you think, or is there just not the evidence?
There isn't as much evidence to back that up, but I would err in that direction. I think that's probably the fairest I can say.
Students, when they came to Durham, would they all tend to congregate to one church that was a student hub, or would they keep some kind of class identity and kind of related to this, why did you go to the church that you went to, and why didn't you then transition to the Methodists when you fell in love?
Well, it depends how far back you're asking me some of those questions, really. Certainly in the 1990s, there were various churches which a Christian Union approved of a particular perspective, which is a perfectly valid perspective, but it's not one I'm particularly comfortable in. That, I think, is all a relatively modern phenomenon. People who didn't share that view tended, I think, to go to churches that suited their style more so. I think St Oswald's would attract some students who like to sing in the choir or to ring the bells. The one we've never mentioned anywhere is the Roman Catholics. We had a very nice university chaplain in the 1990s whose basic approach was, if you don't tell me you're not Catholic, I won't tell you you can't have communion, which worked very nicely for everybody. And of course, being a collegiate university, most of the colleges have their own chapels. So it's more like Oxford and Cambridge in that respect. Oh, why didn't I become a Methodist? Yes. Well, I could never live with that. I love working with Methodists, but it's not my style. Stephen.
How much of the Presbyterianism goes back into the 18th or even earlier century, and how much was created during the 19th century as a result of Scottish movement here?
Well, in this case, it was much more that the people who had been Presbyterians stopped being Presbyterians because they couldn't stay as Presbyterians and remain Orthodox, really. So they ended up with what I often refer to as expedient congregationalism. And it's very clear that here the revived later Presbyterian group had quite a strong Scottish flavour. The extent to which that's true across the rest of the country, I think, varies significantly. In some places it's less true than they would have you believe, and in other places it's perhaps a little more true than they would have you believe.
I'm really fascinated. I have a question about trade, and I'm wondering, we talked here about the different influences that shaped the dissenting church. Mustard is very big in Durham, isn't it? Was that not one of the big trades? I was wondering how much that influenced the shapes of dissenting churches. So
yeah, I mean, in essence, you've got a not quite regional centre, but a centre for a wide area. So it's the place people will come to, and so it's full of shops and trades. Mustard and wool and carpentry were all particularly big. I think the mustard people were eventually taken over by Colemans, who of course were Congregationalists from Norwich.
Just wondering, certainly in my studies of women in the church, being on the periphery is actually an advantage at times, because when you're far away from the centre of power, you can get away with more. It does seem to me that what Durham has going for it is it's far away from London, and therefore in many respects it can be an ideal centre for dissent for all the traditions, if it wants to be. And I even wonder whether this island in itself is a very important symbol. It's got an alternative identity which can carve out a voice, and it's far enough away to get on with things and not be noticed if it wishes to, and that gives it quite a lot of a platform over the centuries in lots of different ways.
Yes. Yes. Although, of course, they were doing it under the eye of the Prince Bishop.
Sometimes presumably with the collusion of?
Some more than others, I think.
Yes, depending who the Prince Bishop was.
Yes.
Yes.
Would it be seen as kind of more local people, obviously having the cathedral and the university, like would they see this actually representing them in that way that it could be collusion, or was this kind of seen as like, you know, an extension of the establishment up north?
I'm not sure where to begin on that. I think it was more its own establishment in the local area. And the Prince Bishop was very much in charge of everything. They were almost had the monarchy delegated to them at their peak.
One gets a sense of that very much today, going to the palace at Bishop's Auckland, which has recently, I think, been regenerated and is very well worth seeing. And this comes across.
Maybe if anyone has one last burning question, I'd be happy to take it. Otherwise, that was a very stimulating presentation. Thank you, Michael, for contextualising us in the city that we are and starting us off. We have a little gift for you.
Thank
So
you.
thank you ever so much.